I would like to address directly the two issues at stake in the title of this panel, as our chairman has just mentioned. And I would like to give an affirmative answer, maybe a bit skeptical, but mainly affirmative answer to both questions. So therefore, I would like to argue that first, yes, there is a crisis in the European project. The European project is in crisis. Second, yes, it can be reformed. And third, I would like to argue that the main direction of this reform should be, I will submit, more flexibility rather than more supranational integration. I think we need the European Union to become more supple and more open to different choices by national parliaments. I think we need what is sometimes called a Europe à la carte, or with a variable geometry that allows different countries and different groups of countries to engage into different degrees of integration. Therefore, I will speak mainly on this idea of reform of the European Union, and I will do this hopefully within the time limit that you kindly gave me. So I will do this mainly in two main stages or steps. First, I will try to identify very briefly the sources of the so-called malaise in the EU, and especially in the Eurozone. I will not address the question of immigration that has been discussed. I will be mainly speaking about the Eurozone. Second, I will try to justify why I think flexibility rather than supranational integration should be the direction of reform. Having said that, let me now add, though, that we should not forget the past successes of the European Union. So I'd like to start by making a word in favor of the past successes of the European Union. I think the European Union has been so successful that many countries want to join the club. The EU has been a force for democracy after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and even before that, after the transitions to democracy in Portugal, Greece, and Spain. Has played a crucial role in stabilizing these new democracies, promoting free and peaceful cooperation among old rival European nation states, and upholding laws, practices, and institutions that serve as examples of how one can and perhaps should embrace democracy and the rule of law. So that's my first word in favor of the European Union. On the other hand, though, I think we should not and we cannot overlook the growing sense of unease that seems to be spreading throughout several, probably most European Union member states. One symptom, one example of that growing unease is, I think, that parties that are well out of the mainstream and some even flatly extremists, like I would give the example of Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain, to mention just these two on the far left. They are now drawing significant voter support. In most cases, these parties promote aggressive nationalism, sometimes using the rhetoric of the radical left, sometimes that of the radical right. The language of national rivalry and class struggle, or of national rivalry as class struggle, is making its way back into public discourse. A north-south divide seems to be emerging within the Eurozone, especially within the Eurozone, as Southerners complained about rich and greedy Northerners, and Northerners run their connections to lazy and profligate Southerners. I think one cannot, and perhaps one should not help recall the warning sounded by the French liberal philosopher and historian Élie Alevi in his eloquent Rhodes Lectures at Oxford in 1929, when he spoke of the mutual contribution that revolutionary politics and nationalist politics were making to bringing about what he called l'ère des tyrannies, the age of tyrannies. So, in this spirit of recalling Elia Levy's warning about this combination of revolutionary and nationalist politics, I think a crucial question consists, of course, in trying to identify its sources. I found an earlier presentation by the previous editor of Prospect, David Goodhart, yes. Very interesting. I will have several points in common with what he said, even though I will probably look at the issue from a different point of view. And I actually tried to address this question of the sources of this rise of this extreme or out of the mainstream parties in two articles in the Journal of Democracy, which is published in Washington, D.C., as well as in a book that will be published very soon by Routledge of London. In the first article at the Journal of Democracy, back in October 2012, I argued that the rise of these parties in Europe could well emerge as a result of a mistaken and monist, as opposed to pluralist, view or understanding of the project of the European single currency, the euro. I have argued that the phenomenon was particularly evident in Greece at the time, I'm talking about 2012, and perhaps Italy would follow suit. Indeed, it partly followed suit. In both countries, technocratic governments were appointed with the mission of restoring fiscal discipline as a condition for remaining in the Eurozone. Elections eventually took place in Greece, as you may recall, and I then said, and they are to come in Italy, I wrote at that time, and the results in Greece were appalling. Previously almost unknown far-left party known as Syriza became Parliament's second largest, big enough to prevent mainstream center-left and center-right parties from forming a working coalition. A second election finally allowed the center-right New Democracy Party to lead a coalition government, but Syriza still managed to come second. Well, this was at the time. Now, in January 2015, Syriza actually won the election, as we all know, and is now running the government. The Greek experience, I argued at the time, reveals what I think went wrong with the whole process of defending and preserving the euro in its present format. When the unelected government was appointed in Athens, it was presented as an inevitable solution to save the euro. A similar argument was made in Italy and resonated throughout Europe. Remaining in the euro, furthermore, was treated as a kind of fate beyond democratic dispute. The Euro Treaty itself, as you know, has no exit clause. An even more basic mistake, in my view, was to claim that the exit of even a single country from the Eurozone would leave it hopelessly undermined. And a further and similar mistake, also in my view, has been the introduction of a balanced budget clause into the fiscal pact that 25 of the EU's 27 members at the time actually have signed. All these measures, I think, sent the same message. The euro was beyond dispute, demanded balanced budgets, and decisively removed crucial national questions, such as what currency to use or how to design fiscal policy, from the hands of national parliaments and mainstream parties. So these questions were removed from national parliaments and mainstream parties. To shift the metaphor, a crop had been sown that extremist parties were only too ready to harvest, and this was the case of Syriza and Podemos. They started by saying that the euro, the austerity policies, and the mainstream parties were simply instruments of a privileged capitalist oligarchy acting through Berlin and Brussels. The upshot has been an alarming resurgence of talk about class and national struggle in the continent, or maybe on the continent. Unfortunately, my humble predictions in 2012 have been overtaken by the reality of the elections for the European Parliament in May 2014. And some of these parties that enter the European Parliament in 2014 are far to the left, others are far to the right, and the number traffic in a rhetoric again of class or racial struggle that is problematic at best and reprehensible at worst. In another article in Journal of Democracy in October 2014, I have argued that the reason for the success of the extremist parties lies less in any underlying radicalization of European voters than in what all these parties have in common. That's my main argument today here. And in that sense, I sort of approach some of the views presented by David Goodhart. So what they have in common is that they are all voicing a claim that mainstream liberal democratic parties have been ignoring. This claim amounts to an appeal to decentralize more powers to the local, that is to say, in the case of the European Union, to the national level, and to put more control back into the hands of elected national parliaments. It has seldom been observed that the mainstream parties within the European Union have simply abandoned the decentralization issue to extremist parties. When it comes to the question of decentralizing versus centralizing power, competition among the European Parliament main political families has been lacking, in my view. The Christian Democratic, the Socialist, and the Liberal Party groups in the European Parliament all favor the more Europe option of an ever closer union. The lack of mainstream party voices defending decentralization and more local power has created a vacuum that extremists are exploiting. They have mixed their extreme views with support for decentralizing power away from Brussels and back into the hands of national elected institutions. The effect of this mixture is toxic, allowing what should be a reasonable appeal for decentralization to be combined with the language of class struggle, aggressive nationalism, and sometimes even crude racism. So now I would like to move very quickly to the second step of my argument, that the direction of reform should be flexibility, not further uniform integration at the European Union level. I would in fact like to argue that the European Union should abandon the dogma of more Europe. In fact, it must, in my view, normalize what I call the unfortunate dichotomy between more and less Europe. It must recognize that this is a normal subject of discord and that equally committed Europeanists may disagree on this issue. As a result, I would argue, mainstream parties in Europe, Christian Democrats, Liberals, and Socialists, must be, in my view, willing to host and give voice to views that favor decentralization instead of simply rejecting those voices as anti-European. In other words, the opposition to more Europe should, in my view, not be equated with anti-Europeanism, understood as outright opposition to the EU or a demand for one's country to withdraw from it. That is, and this is my crucial point, it needs to be possible to advocate fewer powers for Brussels without thereby having to become anti-EU. Now, for this to be possible, I think we need a major conceptual transformation of the debate within the EU. It will demand the abandonment of what I think is the needlessly dogmatic and indeed misleading debate about the future role of the European nation states versus that of the supranational European state. I actually think nobody knows what the future of the nation state in Europe or elsewhere will be. As Karl Popper repeatedly argued, the future is open and there is no iron law of history that predetermines how our societies will evolve in the long future. For this reason, those who claim that the nation state can never be superseded in Europe, I think are making a prophecy that cannot be empirically tested. But the same is true, exactly the same is true of those who claim that the age of the nation state in Europe is now gone for good. I think these are two prophecies that cannot be tested. We cannot know the future of the nation state. What we know, what we can know, and in fact we know, is that people in Europe disagree about the relative merits of the nation state versus the supranational state. And we also know how liberal democracies deal with disagreement. Instead of trying to abolish or outlaw disagreement, liberal democracies live with and by disagreement. They do not banish disagreement, they tame it and civilize it. This is why liberal democracies must fear the clash of opposing fundamentalist views and should embrace the wisdom of keeping conflict as much as possible on what I call a normal level, not a constitutional level, but a day-to-day level. One of the most powerful liberal democratic tactics for controlling conflict or taming conflict is to allow room for gradual change, gradual adjustment, and gradual learning through trial and error. I'm just coming to the conclusion, Mr. Chairman. This means basically, I submit, that we should offer more choices, not fewer. In present circumstances, this means allowing different countries or groups of countries to adopt different degrees of integration according to their national preferences democratically expressed at the national level. This is already happening as regards both the single currency and the Schengen Agreement regarding movement across the intra-EU borders, from which some member states have opted out, as you know. There is no reason, in my view, why this principle of variable geometry, or Europe à la carte, cannot be extended to other areas of politics and legislation. And I'd like to add that it seems to me that the recent election of Donald Tusk, Prime Minister of Poland, as the new President of the European Council, may indeed constitute a hopeful sign that the path to more flexibility is or can be considered. Poland, as we know, is simultaneously a proud member of the European Union and a very proud independent nation. It is not a member of the euro. Poland is therefore, in my view, in one of the best positions to contribute to a gradual process of adjustment that allows more flexibility within the European Union. And the fact that the candidacy of Donald Tusk was supported both by Germany and Britain is, I think, a further hopeful sign that this adjustment is still possible. To conclude, let me say that in my articles in the Journal of Democracy, I have recalled that the euro and indeed the whole European project have been relative successes so far, but they have been and will be successful only on a voluntary basis. This voluntary nature of the European Union should now, in my view, be reinforced so that the EU structure becomes even more supple and open to different choices by national parliaments.